Hello, you're welcome once again to my YouTube channel. This is Professor Doctor, and I encourage you to watch this video. And I know at the end of this video, you will understand what we term as partial pivoting in solving systems of linear equations. Please, if you are new here, kindly watch this video, subscribe, comment, and share this video for the benefit of others. Okay, sure. So let's start. In partial pivoting, or in naive Gauss elimination, what we always do is that we follow some algorithms, right? So I am going to teach you the algorithm in order for you to get the answer or come out with the unknowns or the values of the unknowns. And this is how the algorithms works. First thing, you have to first do what you call forward elimination. Then you do what's called backward substitution. But with the forward elimination, we have two stages. We have the first stage and we have the second stage. That is for the forward elimination. Then with the backward substitution, it is just once, right? So um we have the matrix given there and some constant x1, x2, x3, and also 201, and we are asked to find the values of x1, x2, and x3, right? Okay, so let's see how we can go about this. We have to pivot the first element in row 1. I'm talking about this in order to cause the one below to go to 0, to go to 0. So we pivot the one on top, that's the first row, the one at the first row, first column. We pivot that, and to help us decompose 2 to go to 0. We also pivot on the 0, the same value here, to cause the 1 to go to 0. Then we also pivot, that is for the first step of forward elimination. And for the second step of forward elimination, we pivot on the negative, this value, this value here. We pivot on this value here to cause the one below, that is the one, to also go to 0. Basically, that's what we are coming to do. But because we are dealing with partial pivoting, this is the algorithm. You first have to check if the pivot element is less or greater, right? That lead to switching of rows. And listen very well. All that I want to say is that for you to start with partial pivoting, the pivot element, so here the pivot element is this and this, should be greater than the element below. So these are the elements below, 2, 1, and 1. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's start with the first step. So it means that with the first step, we are going to only pivot on this. So you first find the absolute value of this 0, then you find absolute value of 1, then you find absolute value of 2, and you compare. The pivot element has to be greater than the one below, right? So in this case, the pivot element is supposed to be 2, and the ones that has to be it below the 2 should be 0 and 1. That is what I'm talking about. That is what we term as switching of rows, right? Okay, so you realize that when you find the absolute value of 0, 2, and 1, the absolute value of 0 is 0, absolute value of 2 is 2, absolute value of 1 is 1. So comparing absolute value of 0, 2, and 1, which one is greater? The absolute value of 2 is the maximum one. So it means that the 2 has to be the pivot element rather than the 0, right? So the 2 has to be the pivot element. So it means that you have to switch row 1. So this is row 1, this is row 2, and this is row 3. So in order for 2 to go on top or to replace 0, you have to switch row 1 and row 2, right? And this is how. Okay, so we can see now row 1 is here. Now you can see row 1. Okay, let me erase this. Sorry, let me erase this. Let me erase it. Okay, sure. Okay, so we can see I have I've kind of um interchanged, or I have switched row 1 and row 2 because the absolute value of 2 is greater than that of um 1 and 0, right? So this was the main question, that because the absolute value of 2 is greater than 0 and 1, I have to switch in between row 2 and row 1, because I've told you that the pivot element should be the greater value, or I should have the greater value in order to prevent round off or errors. Okay, so upon doing that, we come up with this equation. Upon doing that, we come up with this equation. So now this represents row 1. This becomes our new row 2, and this becomes our new row 3. So then you follow the algorithm. Then we now want to cause the value below the pivot element. So remember, this is now our pivot element. So now we want to cause 0. This 0 is already 0, but we want to cause 0 to go to 0, but it's already 0, right? Then we also want to cause 1 to also go to 0, right? So that is for the first step of forward elimination. So before we do that, this is how we can make them go to 0. We find row 1. So row 1, then you multiply it by 0 over 2. So you multiply it by 0 over 2. Multiply it by 0 over 2. So when you do that, all the rows here is going to 0, because 0 over 2 times 2 will be 0. 0 over 2, 0 over 2 times negative 1 will be 0. 0 over 2 times negative 1 will be 0, and also 0 times 0 will also be 0, right? Okay, so this is what I was talking about. You multiply 0 over 2 by row 1. So when you do that, you're going to get 0. Then you also subtract row you subtract row 2 row 2 1 prime from row 2, right? So now you have your row 2. So now you know that this is your row 2. This is your row 2. So you pick the values, then you just you just subtract it from the one that you multiply, right? Okay. So when you do that, you are going to get when you subtract, you are going to get 0, negative 1, 2. You are going to get 0, negative 1, 2. Then what you do is that you also have to cause this one to go to 0, right? And in order for this one to go to 0, you just divide it by 2, right? You divide it by the, so remember that I told you that this is the pivot element. 2 is the pivot element. So if you want, that is what will help you to convert 1 to go to 0. So you divide 1 by 2, then you multiply it by row 1. When you do that and you subtract it from, and you subtract row 2 from it, you are going to get this value, right? Okay, so now my new equation now this becomes my new equation. That is after the first forward elimination. So after the first forward elimination, I'm having this kind of equation, right? So you can see now this one has turned to 0, this one has also turned to 0. Okay, so then I can now do what you called the second step forward elimination. And the second step forward elimination too, all that you have to do is that you have to also pivot this and cause the one below to go to 0, right? Okay, so when you do that, you can only achieve that by multiplying root 2. So you multiply root 2, can only achieve that by multiplying root 2 by 1.5. I'm sorry, 1 over 1.5. So you divide 1 by 1.5, then you multiply it by root 2, right? So when you do that, you are going to get this equation, right? Then you go ahead and then, so now you go ahead, sorry, but you know that, but before you multiply um, root 2 by 1 over 1.5, you see, when you have this new equation, now we are done with the first forward elimination. We are now coming to do the second forward elimination, right? Okay, so you then compare the actual value, the what do you call it? You then compare the pivoting value. This is the pivoting value I'm talking about. This is the pivoting value. You compare it, so you do the same thing as we did. So you compare the pivoting value with the one below. That is 1. You compare 1.5 and 1. You find the absolute value of 1.5. When you find the absolute value of 1.5, you are going to get 1.5. Then you find the absolute value of 1. When you find the absolute value of 1, you are going to get 1, right? Then when you compare the absolute value of 1.5 and 1, you realize that the absolute value of 1.5 is greater than that of 1. I'm sorry, I'm talking about this one. This is the new equation. Sorry, this is the new equation. So you realize that the absolute value for, when you find the absolute value for 1 and that of 1.5, the absolute value of 1.5 is then greater than what, 1. So you have to switch rows, and I have told you that the pivot elements have to be greater than the ones below, right? So it means that 1.5, the 1.5 here should be on top. So you should replace the 1. So the only way we can do that is by switching row 3 and row 2. So when you switch row 3 and row 2, you realize the 1.5 will come and replace the 1, and the 1 will come and replace 1.5. And that was done here. So you realize that you have replaced the 1 with 1.5 as seen there. Then now you can do your second step forward elimination by multiplying row 2 row 2. Now this is row 2. Multiply it by 1 over 1.5. 1 divided by 1.5. So when you do that, you are going to get the equation as seen there. As seen there. Okay, sure. Then we subtract the row 3 from the value. So when you do that, you are going to get this equation, right? So now then the final equation now becomes base. So now we have this as the final equation, right? So sorry, excuse me. Okay, so now we can now find the value of x1, x2, x3. So those are the unknowns. And you can only do that by re-equating this to this, then we equate this to this, then we equate this to this, right? So when you do that, that is done. The can find that of S3 to be 1, that of S2 to be 1, and that of X1 to be also 1. Okay, thank you very much.